And we're back with Milestone's middle school digital shorts. We're in the last week of our series. Okay, let me try that again. We're in the last week of our series on a guy in the Bible named Joseph. And it's called The Big Picture. Why is it called that? Well, Joseph had a lot of wild and weird and unbelievable things happen to him, good and bad. But all along, God was working towards the bigger picture in his life, the bigger picture Joseph just couldn't see. Now, before we get to the last part of Joseph's story today, let me ask you a question. Have you ever tried to get a little payback on someone? Maybe a younger sibling who took your favorite sweater without asking, or a friend who spread a rumor about you, or a friend in your group who always plays pranks on you. I mean, I know I have. You see, way back when I was in middle school, like 5 years ago, I'm kidding. But back then, me and my friends were totally into wrestling, and that's the bottom line, because Chris said so. Anyways, me and my friends were always talking about wrestling and even doing wrestling moves until one day, in the middle of math class, my friend came to me and he kicked me in the gut and he gave me a stunner. And you know what? It kind of looks like this. And you see, all of a sudden, my elbow was hurting and it started to get big. See, what had happened was I fell so hard that I got a blood clot on my elbow and I just had to wait for it to go down. Not cool. But the entire time I was in the nurse's office, I kept thinking of ways to get my friend back in similar ways, right? I never really got the chance to hit him with a wrestling move, but I did get him back one day in the playground. While we were playing Don't Touch the Sand, I pushed him really hard down to the sand to the point where he practically ate it. And then we argued. But we continued to be friends. Now, your story might not be just like mine, but I bet you can relate. How do I know? Because in big or small ways, we've all been wronged. We've all been hurt. We've all been frustrated. We've all had someone to do something to us or say something about us or treat us in a way that makes us want one thing and one thing only: payback. We want the other person to experience the same amount of pain or frustration or embarrassment that we experience because of them. Here's the thing. We all have the power to pay back, and not only have the potential to want to pay back, we have the power to actually do it. Sometimes that payback is public, and we do something directly and openly to the person who wronged us. Maybe that's confronting them in the hallway with a big fight, or spreading a little bit of a rumor around them, or making fun of them in front of other people, or doing something to embarrass them in front of someone else. You know, that kind of payback isn't hard to recognize. It's out there for the world to see, and that's the way that we want it to be. And sometimes the payback is more passive, meaning it's a little less obvious and a little more behind the other person's back. Maybe that's spreading a rumor about them, or moving seats at the lunch table, or just rolling your eyes when they walk away. Though the other person may not recognize or feel the consequence of it right away, you're still getting the payback you're looking for in a more subtle way. Or maybe for you, the payback is just in your head. You haven't taken a step to actually do the payback, either publicly or passively, but you think about it all the time. You're constantly setting up scenarios in your mind on how you're going to get the payback you want. And even though you may not actually take the steps to make it happen, it still consumes you. Now, listen, I know this all sounds harsh, but we're all friends here, right? Can we just be honest with each other and admit that we've all felt that way a time or two? There's just something about payback that feels fair to us. But just because payback feels fair, it doesn't mean it is fair. It doesn't mean that it's what's best for us. In fact, I think there's a better approach we could take if we all put down our power to pay back. Now, if there was anyone who had reason for wanting payback, it's our guy Joseph. His story is full of people betraying him, lying about him and causing him years of pain and suffering. And that he probably didn't even deserve. To give you a quick recap, Joseph was one of a dozen sons, but his father Jacob loved him the most. Talk about an awkward family dynamic. Because of that, his brothers got so mad that they threw him into a well, and eventually they sold him into slavery, where he ended up in Egypt. And Joseph was then thrown into prison because of a lie against him, and there he stayed for several years before finally getting released and promoted to work for the Pharaoh. Whew, that's a lot, right? Now, if I put myself in Joseph's sandals for a minute, and yes, I said sandals, right? I can tell you what I'd be thinking about during all those years of slavery and separation from my family and imprisonment. I'd probably be thinking a little else than the best payback that I could give to everyone who wronged me if I got the chance. Wouldn't you? So let's pick Joseph's story back up from where we left off and find out exactly what he did. At this point, Joseph was doing much better. He had not only been released from prison, but he had been elevated to the second in command over all of Egypt. Pharaoh put Joseph in charge of the distribution of food throughout the entire Egyptian empire. And that was a big deal because this was during a period of intense famine in the land. The famine, or shortage of food, was so bad that people from far away started making the journey to Egypt to find food so that they wouldn't starve. Now, of all the people in the world, guess who showed up one day to ask Joseph for food? None other than his brothers, the very same guys who sold him into slavery years ago. What are the chances? See, while Joseph immediately recognized his brothers, they didn't realize who they were speaking with. It had been so long since they'd seen him that they might have even assumed he was dead. And if they didn't, they certainly didn't imagine their brother to be turned into a slave and be the man with so much power in Egypt. And yet, there stood Joseph in a position of complete power before his brothers. They all needed his help. They all needed him to save their lives. And in that moment, he had the power to pay back all the wrong they'd committed against him. This was the moment that Joseph could have been dreaming of, the moment when payback would finally be his. But take a look at what happened next. Joseph could stand it no longer. There were many people in the room, and he said to his attendants, out, all of you. So he was alone with his brothers when he told them who he was. Then he broke down and wept. He wept so loudly that the Egyptians could hear him, and word of it quickly carried to Pharaoh's palace. I am Joseph, he said to his brothers. Is my father still alive? But his brothers were speechless. They were stunned to realize that Joseph was standing there in front of them. Please come closer, he said to them. So they came closer, and he said again, I am Joseph, your brother, whom you sold into slavery in Egypt. But don't be upset and don't be angry with yourselves for selling me to this place. It was God who sent me here ahead of you to preserve your lives. You can live in the region of Goshen where you can be near me with all your children and grandchildren, your flocks and herds and everything you own. I will take care of you. For there are still 5 years of famine ahead of us. Otherwise, you, your households, and all your animals will starve. Wait, what? Joseph could have done literally anything he wanted to his brothers. He could have paid them back times 1,000,000 for what they have done to him. He could have left them to starve or snapped his fingers and had them thrown into prison or even killed. That's how much power he had to pay them back. But instead, Joseph took a different path. He chose forgiveness. I mean, how amazing is that? Can you imagine how surprised Joseph's brothers must have been? One minute, they found out that their brother Joseph was alive. And then in the next, he was embracing them rather than giving them what they deserved. Here's what I think we can learn from this part of Joseph's story. When you can't see the bigger picture, choose to forgive. Joseph's response to his brothers gives us a powerful example of how God wants us to deal with the people who wrong us. We may never know why they did what they did. They may never apologize for the hurt or embarrassment they've caused us. There are details of a bigger picture that we'll never see or understand, but we still have a choice: forgiveness or payback. And we have the power to choose. Think of it this way. If you're in a relationship with another person, say a parent, a friend, a sibling, anyone, there's something that connects the two of you. There's a bridge. But when someone wrongs or hurts you, that bridge is suddenly broken. It becomes shaky, and the connection between the two of you is damaged. Then you're left with a choice. You can either burn the bridge, breaking it down completely, or paying back wrong for wrong or hurt for hurt. Or you can build the bridge, reestablishing your connection, and things like forgiveness, grace, and peace. Of course, I'm not saying you just keep rebuilding bridges with people who have hurt you so deeply and repeatedly. Sometimes the best way to actually choose forgiveness is to set some healthy boundaries or talk about the wrongs done to you with someone who can help. But when it's possible, it's your job to lay down or our right to pay back and instead choose forgiveness. Joseph could have made the choice to prove a point. He could have fought to be right. He could have chosen not to help his brothers and burn the bridge between them, but instead, he chose to forgive them. And that changed everything. When you can't see the bigger picture, choose to forgive. I'm sure some of you are hearing this and thinking, yeah, that sounds nice, but how can you actually do that? How can you choose forgiveness instead of payback? That's a really fair question because honestly, this is really hard stuff. It's hard to choose to be a bridge builder rather than a bridge burner. And what can make it even harder is when we can't see the bigger picture, when we don't know all the details or the full story about the situation we're in. So, how do we start? Well, one, start small. Practice extending things like grace, forgiveness, and peace to others in small ways. When a friend teases you and hurts your feelings, when your sibling eats the last piece of cake that you've been saving, or when your parents snap at you for something that wasn't your fault, practice choosing forgiveness rather than responding with payback. The more you do this in the small, everyday things, the easier it will be to do when the bigger things come your way. 2, forgive first. Think about your own life for a second. Who has wronged you recently? You don't need to wait for them to apologize to forgive. You don't need to wait for them to make the first move and say sorry for what they've done. The beauty of forgiveness is that you can do it on your own, right now. You can make a move to forgive first so that you can move on. And 3, pursue forgiveness. We can't always control the way people treat us, but we can control the way that we treat them in response. We can pursue forgiveness. What would it look like for you to forgive someone who has wronged or hurt you this week? Maybe it's an outward step like starting a conversation or inviting them to sit with you again, or unblocking them on social media. Or maybe it's a more inward step, a prayer you pray in your heart, or a choice you make to not say rude things, or a conversation with a person you look up to help you. Whatever it is, take one step this week to pursue forgiveness rather than payback in your relationships. Of course, forgiveness is not always easy, but the good news is we have a God who is the best at forgiving. He's forgiven each and every one of us, and He wants to help us to do the same with others. And when we ask for His help forgiving someone, He will always give it. Today, maybe that's where you need to start. Ask God to help you to forgive someone who has wronged you so that you can start building a bridge towards forgiveness rather than payback. And remember, even when you can't see the bigger picture, choose to forgive. Joseph's story is pretty crazy, right? I mean, he was a part of a family in conflict. He was tossed into a well and sold into slavery by his own brothers. And he was thrown into prison for something he didn't even do. And even though he went through all of these experiences in his life, well, Joseph eventually gained enough power to help and even forgive the family who got him into this mess in the first place. In the middle of all of this stuff, Joseph couldn't see the bigger picture that we see today. The way God was working in his life, he just had to keep trusting and believing and making the next right choice to do what he thought was best. And eventually, years later, it all made sense. Things were made right. He finally saw the big picture. And I think the same can be true in our lives. So as we close our conversation in this series today about Joseph and how he forgave his brothers, I want you to think about this question. What is the hardest thing about choosing forgiveness? Now let me get right back to listening to these records. See y'all later.